Hey friends, Dean here. Before we get you on to your episode, I want to take a moment to invite you to our next virtual online trivia night. Wednesday, May 13th at 8 p.m. Join us either on our Facebook group or on our YouTube page for 3 rounds of fun trivia, music questions, movie questions, general knowledge questions. It'll be a fun time and a chance to win some prizes and have just a good relaxing night of some trivia at home. You don't even have to go out for it. So don't forget, Wednesday, March 13th at 8 p.m. Join us on our Facebook group or YouTube for 3 rounds of fun virtual online trivia. We'll see you there. Blow dry your hair, put on your white suit, and get on the dance floor as we celebrate the epic soundtrack from the film Saturday Night Fever. Stay with us.
Get ready for the 3324 podcast, where lifelong friends Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber share their love of all things music and movies. Dean has directed short films and is a music trivia buff. And Eric, trained in audio engineering, brings his extensive knowledge of music and film to the conversation as they discuss, debate, and celebrate their favorite albums, films, and much more.
Welcome, friends, to the 3324 podcast. Thank you for joining us. Much appreciated. You have found our little corner of the internet where Eric and I huddle together and we talk about music, and we sometimes talk about movies as well, but mainly talk about music, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Of course, you know.
You found us. This is where it is. This is where it's happening.
Us. Yeah.
This is what we would want to be your home for the best in music and movie podcasting. So Thank you for joining us here at the 3324 podcast. Also join us on social media, 3324 podcast. You'll find us at Facebook. We've got a great group there where you can come and hang out and just kind of look at the different things that people post, or you could join us on Instagram as well and just get the photographic version of it. If you just want the photos without the chat, go to Instagram as well. We're there.
Mm-hmm. Yep, we're there.
We're
got present.
All the different corners of the internet covered.
Except for the dark
web. Except for that, we don't go to the dark web.
No, well,
stay away from the dark.
We don't
web.
belong there.
We're on the light. We're out in the lighter part of the internet, talking about music and movies, and we've got a humdinger.
Yes, we do.
Our first soundtrack.
Yeah,
and it's not a score either.
That's right.
Right. So normally you think soundtracks, you're like, oh, we talk about like the score for Star Wars or Superman or something like that. But in a way, this is a score. It is the score. It is the score for the film in a lot of ways, because
it's all original music for the most part. Yeah, or at least it was written
for the most part. We'll get into that. There's some interesting things that went on with this soundtrack too, which is really
There's much to discuss.
Such a phenomenon. So let's get into it. The soundtrack was released in November of 1977. The music as a whole was supervised by Bill Oakes, because there's a lot of different artists on here, a lot of different recordings. So there's not like a producer that did it. There's more somebody that kind of oversaw the whole project.
Yeah.
This soundtrack album won 5 Grammys. For first one, How Deep Is Your Love? For pop vocal in 1978. It won Album of the Year, Best Pop Vocal for the album. Stayin Alive, it won Best Arrangement of Voices for the song Stayin Alive. Producer of the Year, Barry Gibb, was a part of that. It was just hitting on all cylinders. It went, or currently is, 16 times platinum, so that's in excess of 16 million copies, which makes it the second best selling soundtrack of all time, after
The Bodyguard.
Which means it was the best-selling soundtrack of all time for quite a long time. I mean,
it was.
This came out in 77. The Bodyguard was 91, 92. So it had a good reign. It had a good reign over the kingdom of soundtracks.
I have no idea why The Bodyguard is such a monster, but
because of one song.
Really.
Yeah, it's got a lot of other great songs on it. It's got a lot of other great songs on it, though. By no means slighting The Bodyguard, but that was one song that really propelled that album. Was like, I Will Always Love You just became a phenomenon, and that was the only place you could get that song. Yeah. So it was just kind of like, okay, we need to buy the Bodyguard soundtrack. There was a lot of other stuff on there, Queen of the Night, a couple of other great tracks as well. Pound for pound, though, if we're putting Bodyguard and Saturday Night Fever in the ring, I think Saturday Night Fever is just gonna win just for when we get into the singles
wealth of
and
material.
the stuff that came out of this, the material.
Absolutely.
Jeez Louise.
It also captured the culture of the time. I mean, it's one of the best pop cultural statements in music, I think. You got absolutely. The film, you got the soundtrack, you got the music really captured what was happening right then and there. So yeah, it's a phenomenon. Yeah.
And we sometimes we talk about, oh, this album is timeless or whatever. This album is very dated. I mean, it is a snapshot in time. Mm-hmm. It is a snapshot of a particular type of music. And I guess in a way it makes it timeless because of that. The music isn't going to transcend time because it was from the disco era, and the movie was about obviously New York nightlife, and disco was kind of some of the foundation for it and dancing, but the soundtrack just really kind of pushed everything out there onto the radio, and people were just kind of I read some places where disco was kind of already on its way out the door by this time, and mm-hmm. this album kind of helped it limp along. I'm not too sure because I remember this, man. I had a Bee Gees poster in my room. Absolutely.
Why not?
Barry Gibb, absolute man crush. Absolutely. No bones about it. Wanted to be Barry Gibb. Still want to be Barry Gibb. I would take Barry Gibb now. I'd be him. for the kind of career and what he's done.
Yeah.
That guy does. He gets his due, but he does not get enough due for the. I put him up there with some of the great producers and songwriters.
Yeah, sure. I mean, because of this album, of course, the film came out. It was we had it, but then I went back and I love the old stuff. I love those original those songs that they had in the late '60s. That they were. It's no surprise that they took this route. That they just kind of seamlessly made their way into doing this and doing it very well, even though they knew nothing of the New York nightlife to speak of. I mean, it was just more. They came from a background where they enjoyed, I think, Black American music. So their music was very soulful to begin with. So it's no coincidence that it's not a fluke. I should say that they just decided to do disco. So
absolutely. And they're so connected to this type of music and to this album.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about it, is that they were not the first choice, and they were approached actually when the film was in post-production. So the film was done already. But we think that the Bee Gees were so entrenched and the music fits so well with the dance and everything that it had to have been part and parcel.
Right.
But no, believe it or not.
It was not the case. Right. Yeah.
They originally were using Boz Scaggs' song Lowdown as a temp track in the rehearsal scene with Caroline Gorney and John Travolta when they're kind of meeting for the first time and practicing.
Yeah.
They were playing the song Lowdown by Boz Scaggs. And the record label said, no, we're actually going to use that, and he's going to be featured in another disco movie, which never came to pass. So, wow, talk about a miss. Talk about a swing and a miss.
Yeah, right.
That's a great song, but so then what happened is like, okay, we can't use this song. So then I think it was David Shire who did a lot of the instrumental stuff, worked up just something along with the same tempo for that. And then they approached the Bee Gees. Mm-hmm. And they were in the midst of recording their own album, and they came and said, "Hey, can you give us a couple of songs? Can you do this?" And Robin Gibbs like, "No, you're jamming us up. Like we're in the middle of making an album. We ain't got time for this." And lo and behold, they did it, and did not realize that they were going to be constructing a soundtrack. They just thought, "Oh, a couple of songs you need."
You could argue that this is an album for them.
Absolutely.
And what the cool thing was that, a couple of the songs that they did contribute that weren't written specifically for the film were already in that disco vein,
Exactly. This is crazy.
You should be dancing and jive talking. And, so they were already there. They were already working that up. So it wasn't that big of a transition there.
Yeah. Not a big stretch. Absolutely. Right. It was kind of, they had kind of dabbled in it, and they hadn't had any big hits.
I only wish they had Nights on Broadway on the soundtrack. I missed that. I love that song.
Yeah,
That
that's
would
one
have
of
been
my
nice
favorites.
to put that instead of Jive Talking. I don't know,
Yeah.
but
Oh,
we'll
yeah,
get there.
Nights on Broadway was the
Oh
debut
man,
of the
that's one of my
falsetto.
favorites. Yeah,
That's when he discovered that he could sing high
yeah,
out of
yeah,
nowhere. Because if you hear before that, it was always he kind of had that lower register singing.
yeah, yep.
And then they needed someone to do some falsetto, and I'll try it. And this guy goes to the stars with his falsetto like crazy,
Oh my goodness,
like higher than Frankie Valli, higher than Brian Wilson. Really kind of hit the upper registers with it, and it became their signature sound.
Well, that was, I mean, they were great harmonizers to begin with, but the distinction between Barry's falsetto, Robin's, he had that timbre to his voice, that sort of that trembly kind of voice,
Morris,
and then of course Morris had the lower end, so it was the perfect harmonized
family.
sound.
I'm telling you, families sing well. The Beach Boys, it's like right. The Avett Brothers, they all know how to. They sing well together and they harmonize well together.
Well, I think it's because they know each other so well. When you grow up with someone, you get the even when they're fighting, as little kids, you can just imagine.
It's got to be something in the DNA, though. They just have like where the voices are different enough, but there's the same enough where it just kind of blends.
Yeah.
And it's just magic. And the Bee Gees, I'll put them up there with any of the harmonizing groups.
Oh, sure.
As far as harmonies, forget it. Not even from this album. I would go with stuff after this. This kind of like put them on the path, but you get some of the other stuff like Too Much Heaven.
Yeah.
Jeez. Oh, forget it.
Right.
Like, and they got so maligned because of the backlash that would soon come. Disco sucks. They're burning disco records. They got
caught up
to the wolves.
Yeah,
they got thrown to the wolves.
They were like the scapegoats of disco. More or less.
They became like the epitome of what the worst things about whatever the worst things about disco was. I don't know that there is, but they became the face of that, of disco sucks and the Bee Gees and
that's right.
Like,
and you know what? It might have been easier to have done that. When you look at them, it's like these guys are from Australia. Like I said, what do they know about New York? The New York nightlife,
they have
that kind
the
of
hair.
thing.
They had the open shirts at the time too. So they
exactly.
had the look.
They had the look, but it was just but it's easy to kind of really pick that apart and just be like, look at these guys. These guys are a joke. But they're not.
No,
because they've been doing it for a long time.
Since they were kids. Yeah,
that's right.
I mean, you could go on YouTube and I mean, there's videos of like Robin Gibb, like 7 or 8 years old,
that's
him
right.
and Morris singing and Barry, as a trio. So this was in their DNA, just creating music, and they don't get enough credit for musicianship. Well, like Morris is a really great bass player.
Mm-hmm.
They were just looked at as their voices and the high pitched voice and that guy that sings that way. Yeah. And there was a lot more to the Bee Gees. So
he went on to be a great producer, Barry Gibb. I mean, you talk about his production work with some up and coming artists. Established artist. I mean, that voice was always there. That presence was there.
And the songs that he wrote, that he gave to other artists that became hits, like Islands in the Stream with Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers. And he did that whole album with Barbra Streisand, Guilty, where it was kind of like Streisand, but with Barry Gibb. Mm-hmm. He became very much in demand, and everybody wanted him because those people knew. It's like, this guy's got a magic touch. He really knows how to write a song and produce. Robin and Morris, and no slouches either. I mean, they were part of the writing combo, duo, mm-hmm. triplet, trio. I don't know what it is. It's something. It's one of those
the trifecta
groups of people. And then if Andy Gibb was, it would have been a quartet. But unfortunately, he passed very, very early. So when I was young, this was like the thing. Bee Gees. I didn't have the album. I think maybe my sister did, but I had the 45s. I had Stayin Alive on 45, and that thing was just ground right through the acetate.
It was a must have, and I think my brother actually was the one who actually went out and bought it.
Yeah,
but I'm the one who always listened to it.
Yeah.
And I always got flack for always listening to side one, which primarily the Beatles. I mean the Beatles, Bee Gees stuff. And he'd be like, what are you doing? Like, enough with the Bee Gees. We got Kool and the Gang on here, because I wasn't really paying attention to that stuff, right? Because I just loved the Bee Gees at that point, and I just wanted to hear those songs. And
they were the draw.
right. As you start to appreciate music as you get older, that's when I started listening to sides 3 and 4. And you had all this great stuff on there, Casey and the Sunshine Band, and they contributed.
Yeah, even the instrumentals,
quite
I
a bit.
think.
Yeah, David Shire had that. Well, that's a piece of score right there. That one piece of score that appears actually on the album is that take on Night on Disco Mountain, which is famous,
which is kind of a rewrite of Night on Bald Mountain by Gorgsky, which is a classical composer,
which was featured in Fantasia.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just good stuff, man. I mean, and this is like, Kool and the Gang was like the Kool and the Gang before they became the Bee Gees version of Kool and the Gang, so to speak. Like, so when they just started Celebration
and Cherish.
Right. This was like the real funk era, which was great stuff, man. They just,
So there was just, and just a little tidbit about David Shire. He kind of did, he, outside of the Bee Gees, he kind of had the most amount of other stuff, because he did a lot of the instrumental stuff for the most part. Like, we'll call it the score proper. He was married to Talia Shire. He was Talia Shire's husband. That's, and Talia Shire is part of the Coppola family. Francis Ford, Nicolas Cage. If you were in the New York area listening to classic rock radio in the 70s and 80s, it was Mark Coppola, the Cope.
Mm-hmm.
Who was also Nicolas Cage's brother. So a very artistic family, and Aunt Talia Shire was a part of that. So David Shire did a lot of the instrumental dance stuff, which is very listenable and very evocative, I think, of the time as well.
Yeah.
It makes you feel like you're at you're at a disco.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Not that I've ever been to one.
And of course you had, you couldn't do this without having those cultural bands as well. I mean, Tavares, they were a New York based band. They were
Tavares, the Tramps also.
Yeah, exactly. So they had the authentic cultural sound on this record as well. So the Bee Gees, were not, they weren't just left out in the cold there. I mean, you actually had all this mixed bag of stuff, which was more,
the Bee Gees
might argue was more appropriate.
Well, the Bee Gees drove the soundtrack, and then having these other artists filled it out, right? Because you wouldn't want. I don't think we'd want 4 sides of the Bee Gees, no matter how great. You needed these other types of music, because that's what you would hear. You wouldn't just hear one artist at a disco. You would hear all these other things. So that gives you the kind of the disco experience. Like, you put this on, and it's all different types of salsa feeling stuff, and some funky stuff, and then some Bee Gees thrown in. So you kind of get that it's like sitting down, or like putting the record on and being at a disco, which is really neat.
Well, the wonderful thing about it too is that every piece of music you hear on this album was featured in the film. I mean, it got their just due, because there's so many scenes in the disco, and so you hear this music being played just nonstop. I mean, so that, like you said before, this is the score of the movie. Those songs made up that score. So so every song got its day in the sun, so to speak, over those
with one exception, which we'll get to. Jive Talkin' actually is on the soundtrack. It was used in a scene that was cut out of the film. So it was never, but so there, even the stuff that the Bee Gees put is getting thrown away is great stuff. Like, even the outtake, the cut stuff.
It wasn't a song written for the film, and they threw it out.
Exactly. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about this. Like, I was doing the research for this, and I'm like, geez, okay. Usually, when we do our shows, we'll talk about what singles were released, right? And that's kind of centers or grounds our conversation. So let me roll off the singles that were released, but then there's more to this conversation, which is crazy.
Right.
So there were 6 singles released from the album, right?
Mm-hmm.
So How Deep Is Your, and this is the order they were released in: How Deep Is Your Love, More Than a Woman, Stayin' Alive, If I Can't Have You, Boogie Shoes, and Night Fever. I mean, that's 6 right there. That's just crazy, right?
Yeah.
But then, when I was listening to this, or when you think about it, I'm like, well, Disco Inferno wasn't released as a single, right? And then I'm thinking Jive Talkin' wasn't released as a single. And then I'm thinking You Should Be Dancing wasn't released as a single.
And
then I'm thinking a fifth of Beethoven, that wasn't released as a single, because everybody knows that.
Yeah.
Right? And then I'm thinking Boogie Shoes was, but it was kind of weird. So I started doing some more research, and it turns out that, okay, 6 singles were released from the album, but Disco Inferno was re-released by Atlantic Records because it was from an older album by the Tramps. Yeah. Jive Talkin', of course, was number 1 in 1975. You Should Be Dancing was number 1 in 1976 from the Bee Gees.
Yeah.
A Fifth of Beethoven was number 1 in 1976 as well, before the movie came out.
So they all had their day in the sun.
And Boogie Shoes was re-released from the label in 1978 and hit number 35. So I was like, so wait, that's 6, 7, 8. That's like 10. That's like 10 singles that were either kind of released from the soundtrack or re-released by the label because it came from other albums that it was called for, and then kind of put in a compilation. That's so crazy.
In a sense, it was a precursor to a period movie like soundtracks. Like you think of Scorsese when he picks songs from like the 70s. They already did this in the 70s, right then and there. So these songs were already like I said, they were already released. They did, but they used them for this film and gained that, and they got massive airplay, even if they weren't on the necessarily on the charts at this stage of the game, but they were still getting a lot of that airplay.
They got a lot of mileage and got reinvigorated from it. Yeah. And like Disco Inferno was kind of not a big hit on its first go around, but then it starts hitting, and then the Atlantic says, okay, let's get this out, like on our label, because it wasn't being released as a single. But that should just tell you, everybody was listening to this, and everybody was just, these songs were all over the radio. It was just crazy. Fit the Beethoven, they used to play that thing all the time.
Oh yeah.
Which is by Walter Murphy, which is basically a disco version of Beethoven's Fifth, obviously.
That's right. It just, oh God, it just takes you back, man. That for me, it's you think about those days, simpler times. Well, because we were kids. Well, you and I don't think really experienced. We loved the music, but we weren't. You and I were not out in the clubs.
No, we were dancing. We were not dancing. We weren't
old enough
to Brooklyn Bridge. We were not dangling off the edge of the Brooklyn Bridge, and
But my brother was, and his, and his buddies, they were doing those kinds of things, and I know it. And so when I, even when I watch the film, I see that there's that reality to that. So that I knew that what they were doing was part of it. And, that made the music all the more special for me. Like, just, you felt like it was the soundtrack of our lives, in a sense, like if you're from New York, you can't deny the power of this record,
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was all over. I mean, it was, we're not just talking New York. It was a big hit everywhere, but it's just,
Now, if you want to add insult to injury, there was 3 other songs recorded for the soundtrack, but not used, which was the song Emotion, which was by Samantha Sang.
Love it.
Written by Barry Gibb.
Right.
Our Love, Don't Throw It Away, which was recorded by Andy Gibb, which became a hit, but the Bee Gees recorded it as well.
Yeah.
And then they recorded a version of If I Can't Have You, which on the soundtrack was done by Yvonne Elliman, written by the Bee Gees. The Bee Gees recorded a version as well, but it would not show up until one of their greatest hits.
Mm-hmm.
Those 3 songs right there were other power. I mean, Emotion was like a top 5 song. I think Don't Throw It Away, Our Love was another one. That's the throwaway.
They became
popular
as a result.
What the hell is going on here?
I know. It was
like, you really need to understand the power of this album and what. Even the toss-offs or the things they didn't use they released them anyway and became chart hits no matter what.
Yeah,
it's absolutely, like, when I was going through it and doing the research, it kind of boggled my mind because I remembered all these songs.
Yeah,
and I didn't put together that I didn't know that, like, Disco Inferno was not originally from the soundtrack; it was actually beforehand. But I knew it from its inclusion in the soundtrack, and that's where I got to know it and Fit the Beethoven and all that stuff, because this album just became such a milestone in not only in music, even if people that, I think it was, like you said, your brother had it. I think even people that weren't into disco or into rock had this album. It was like one of those albums that was in the collection. Like, no matter how you felt, I think that the movie, with the movie taking over and becoming popular, and then I think the soundtrack just really, like exploded. The movie was made for like $3.5 million. It made like 200 and something million back. It was crazy. This was a crazy time.
That's a whole other entity, and we'll talk about that somewhere down the road. But but it's you're right. You can't deny the power, and they dominated the airways for what was it, 3 years, like 2-3 years. I mean, like you say, like Emotion. I remember hearing that song all the time on the radio, falling in love with that song. And you could almost swear that if you didn't know this kind of thing, if you didn't have the soundtrack, these songs would have been on there anyway. Like in your mind, you just put them all together in your own playlist in your head. But
because I certainly could have all fit. We did a quick hit about this, about Barry Gibb and having a hand in the top around this era, having a hand in either writing, producing, or singing on the top 5 songs in a particular week.
Mm-hmm.
And it was around this time where it was Emotion and the Andy Gibb stuff, and then the Bee Gees. I mean, he was basically doing what the Beatles were doing, but he was just doing it with other artists as well. He had a lock either with his brothers as the Bee Gees, or with his brother Andy, or with Samantha Sang, or Yvonne Elliman, just kind of dominating the charts. So you could almost understand where the backlash would start to come in.
Yeah.
Where it's kind of like, okay, all right, Bee Gees, it's
kind of like,
unfortunately, and then they started having that. There was that one incident, or it was at a baseball game, and it was a double header. And in between the games, like, oh, we're going to, disco sucks. We're going to declare the end of disco. And then people started throwing records into the field and then burning them. It became like this whole thing, which kind of really signaled the end of disco for the population at large. They had started to move on from it. Like there was this thing of rock and roll needs to come back, and rock comes back. And, by the time this album was wearing, kind of wearing out its welcome, you're talking 78, 79.
Mm-hmm.
We were on the cusp of the 80s, which was something new on the horizon anyway.
It was something totally new. Yeah.
Yeah. The digital revolution was happening, and music was about to fundamentally change.
Yeah.
Regardless, you had the post-punk, and you had the rumblings of punk in the UK, but on stateside, it was like disco, the discotheques, Studio 54, going out every weekend, getting dressed up and rubbing elbows with all the celebrities that were at the discos. And this was the music that was playing.
Yeah. To go to such extremes like that, to denounce a popular form of music in the culture. I don't know. There had to have been more to it than that. I mean, I think
definitely.
The whole sordid history of Studio 54 and all the controversy.
Yeah, there was some other undertones going on there.
All that kind of stuff happened, but it was just. But to say that, we hate disco, we love rock and roll, well, you know what? Rock and roll didn't come back until like the 90s.
Yeah.
Like we talked about, the grunge movement, really, sort of going back to that analog sound of the 70s. That didn't happen until the 90s. I mean, the 80s just had all this. So who's to say that the music of the 80s was any better? I wish I could take some of the music from the 80s and throw it into
I don't think you're right. I don't think it was a response, but what was a response though was the early seeds of hip hop music were rooted in disco, because they would take the disco records and play that beat behind it and loop
they
it.
Were sampling, they were
sample it and then rap over it. So we would not have had those early hip hop like Sugar Hill Gang and using like groups like Chic. Right. And using their backup, the backing tracks for that to rap over. And that was all those disco 12-inch singles and those extended remixes. I mean, for crying out loud, Disco Inferno is 10 minutes long on this soundtrack.
Yeah.
It's a monster, and it closes out the album. I mean, it just ends on this epic disco song, like totally closes out the album. So you know what you're getting with this.
In a sense, disco did not die in the realm of black artists at the time, and it
evolved. It was used for something else.
Evolved. It helped them evolve into something new, which was fantastic.
Absolutely, they were able to say, "Oh wow, this beat is interesting. Let me kind of do something over it." Because a lot of that disco music was just straight up instrumental. There wasn't a whole lot of the vocal stuff. And that's why people say, the Bee Gees disco. But, if you went to a disco, you really probably weren't hearing Staying Alive. You were probably hearing something a little like I Feel Love by Donna Summer, which is more more music oriented than it is vocal oriented, although there are vocals on that song, but it was just a different type of form. I think that's where on this album, the second disc really comes into focus, because I think that's probably more really representative.
Right. Of the
experience.
Right. Exactly. So
and my man KC is on the second.
There you go.
Second album.
So you had that authenticity of wow. Delete that.
No, we're leaving it in.
Of course you are.
It's staying.
No, you had it, but you had it. You had that, that's the stuff that, you had to have that, because the Bee Gees, there might be some people who, like I said, argued that point of, oh, this isn't real disco. This is somebody, this is a pop group from Australia doing this. They don't really know. Like, I imagine there's a lot of harsh critics even then that probably said that, but so they had to kind of put that stuff on there, I think, to really capture the real, what was really going on in the clubs and the music that was being played. And you go back and you listen to this stuff and it's so rich in the musicality of it,
just the layers.
You can't beat it. You can't beat those the lush production of strings and horns and just the beats and there's so much going on there just from a recording standpoint.
The cowbell. I love hearing disco songs with cowbell in it for some reason.
Yeah. You cannot, you can't beat that stuff. And then what do we get? We get these little, punk rock came along. You got 3 chords being played. Is that any, is that any better? I mean, it is to a certain extent,
it's different.
If you're into that,
it's better or worse.
Yeah. But, you just can't beat that sound, that full on sound that I just, I could still listen to this day,
Yeah. Oh, I was like listening to it and I'm like, I'm going to put this on again, like right after it, and more so, the Bee Gees stuff has been listened to, over and over again. And like you had said, like most people are going to go for the first album and mainly the first side, because it's like, oh, it's kind of like the Bee Gees' greatest hits for the most part. You can have that first side and be very happy with it. But
right.
I think what people tend to miss is that second record. A lot of people probably don't pull that out because oh, Night on Disco Mountain, what's that? What's Open Sesame? And those are a lot of great songs, and it helps inform and shape the whole experience.
Yeah, if you own the vinyl, if you still have your copy of the vinyl, that I'm sure that first disc is probably all scratched up, and the second disc is probably nice and
fresh,
and fresh and new. You put it on, and it's just there's no scratches. There's no.
The good thing is now you can enjoy that second one now because it's still in great shape, and you don't have to hunt down another one. But let me ask you this: if we take out the Bee Gees, right? What are some of your favorite songs that the Bee Gees did not perform on?
Okay.
Because that's easy. It'll be easy just to pick Bee Gees songs all day.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Kool and the Gang. I love that one. I love KC and the Sunshine Band.
That was Open Sesame.
Open Sesame. Yep. The instrumental stuff is great. It's just, I do love Tavares' version of More Than a Woman. Yeah. So if you count that, if the Bee Gees wrote it, but I do like that version. I like the contrast between the two. And it's nice that they included both on the soundtrack because one is the rehearsal, the other is the actual performance, and I'm glad that they did it that way in the film because it's such a beautiful transition, to that moment. But it's just a different sound altogether. So I appreciate the fact that they use both, and I really like that song.
Yeah,
but I mean, just pretty much the whole thing. I mean, it's just the whole disc. It really, I don't have like an actual favorite song aside from the Bee Gees, but I mean, just the whole cultural aspect of it is what I like about it. It's more than nostalgia. I think it's just, it's a piece of history, like music history, a piece of our personal histories, even though like I said, we weren't out there on the streets. We weren't doing those kinds of things, but we knew. We
were listening to the music, though. We were listening.
We saw it. We went outside. We saw the culture. We saw what was going on at the time, and you really felt like you fit into those times. So
Yeah, because it was everywhere. It really worked its way into the culture pretty quickly.
It did.
Because again, if you look at the budget for the film, it was like $3.5 million. It was not a big budget film. John Travolta was known for Welcome Back, Kotter, so he certainly was not like a big, and back then that transition didn't really happen too often, where someone goes from TV to movies. Usually you're a TV actor, that's what you live and die. That's what you are.
You're a TV actor for life.
Yeah, you end up on The Love Boat. You end up on these other like once your show ends, you start doing guest spots, Fantasy Island here and there. But he was able to transcend that, and then obviously once he did that, it was like he did another movie which had a monster soundtrack, which was Grease.
Yeah. And
then he did another movie which had a monster soundtrack, which was Urban Cowboy.
That's right.
He was for some reason the face or on the precipice of this. When Grease came out, then everybody was kind of into the nostalgia and going back to the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And then he does Urban Cowboy. Then all of a sudden everybody was listening to country music.
Yeah.
And because you're looking for love and
which was
all
odd.
Those types of songs started to cross over into the charts. And
yeah.
I don't know what it is about Travolta. I mean, he just seems to be in movies that have, and then he was in Pulp Fiction, which was another movie that had a monster soundtrack.
That's right.
I don't know what's with this guy.
I don't know. I mean, and of course he appeared in Saturday Night Fever, had a sequel, Stayin' Alive,
okay.
Which we won't really, it's not, but I mean,
it's not. You're right. It's not.
It's not right, but it also evoked that period of time when movies like Dirty Dancing were out, and Footloose, and
Sylvester Stallone directed that, and he wrote the screenplay, and I think he thought he could probably
Flashdance and that kind of stuff,
update it. But that was another swing and a miss for it. They should have. This is one of those ones that should have just been left alone.
Mm-hmm.
Which they did. Excuse me. They did Grease, and then they did Grease 2. They went to the well again. So sometimes they don't learn their lesson.
I remember one particular story where we were working in this little restaurant in Dobbs Ferry, and
Jimmy's Restaurant.
That's right. And one of our
finest Italian food in Dobbs Ferry, New York at the time.
And we have a mutual friend, Jimmy, and he came in and he goes, "Oh man, I just saw Stayin' Alive," and he was like telling me about the whole movie. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I didn't even know that they even made a sequel. And he's like, yeah, it's and he's like telling me the whole movie. And I'm like, really? I'm like, wow. So like, of course I watched it on cable or something. And I was like, oh, this is horrible.
Yeah.
It was absolutely horrible.
Yeah. Cause it's just kind of, the movie kind of captures just a certain type of group of friends, and it is a snapshot of a moment in time, and this soundtrack, like you had said, you had mentioned nostalgia, but then you said not really, right? Because it's not. Even though the music is dated and from a specific time, I don't listen to this and think this was. I don't listen to it like giggling, like, oh, this is hokey. I listen to it enjoying it. I am enjoying listening to this music, and this score, as it were, this score for a period in time when this was everything back in 77 and 78. Yeah. This music was everything. It was all you heard. You would hear Stayin' Alive on the radio literally 3 to 4 times an hour. Like on AM radio. They were playing the shit out of that song.
That's right. Yeah.
So if you were into taping back then, if you missed it, you could literally stay there, and within 15 to 20 minutes, they were playing it again.
Mm-hmm.
For those tapers.
It was part of, like, I hate, we say this all the time, but it was part of the soundtrack of our lives. It was the absolute, it was a way of life. It was a way of life, because the original title of the film was what? The Tribal Rights of Saturday Night or something to that effect. So it was literally that, like a cultural thing. It was an essay or an article that was written in a magazine.
Yeah.
And they turned that into a film, and so that became
it was like it was almost like a subculture thing of disco in New York, and these guys, and the movie is more kind of, again, so much attention was paid to the disco part of it, but it's really more of a slice of life about these guys, and what they do. They work for they work and do everything for Saturday night so they go out and they
work hard and they play hard.
And and mainly hang out, and the Travolta character is mainly the one that dances, and they are all like in awe of him,
and they idolize him, and so
when you put some of the visuals together with this music, it becomes iconic, right? It just does. Like you can listen to this on its own, but yeah, when it's paired with some of the dance scenes, it really kind of drives it home, and it really kind of solidifies the era. So you can kind of listen to this and take part of the journey, but
the whole bit, the disco ball, the lighting of the club,
the floor was lit with all the squares.
God, the wardrobe. Come on, the fashion of the times. I mean, that in itself is it's like a museum. You watch the movie and you're like, wow, this is because
and that's where I learned how to put two slices of pizza on top of each other and eat it at the same time.
That's the only way to eat it.
It's double up. You double up. He stacked those two slices of pizza.
Oh my God!
I watched the paint cans.
I watched my youngest son watch that. He didn't watch the movie, of course, the whole movie, but watched the one scene, and he's like, "What is that? What is he doing?" I'm like, "That's the way you eat pizza." He's like, "No." Because nobody, for some reason, nobody in my family, my immediate family, knows how they don't eat pizza by folding it in half. This is the way to eat pizza.
Well, he put two slices on. He put two slices on top.
Yeah, but even folding the one slice,
even folding it, you have to fold your pizza.
You got to fold it. That's the way to eat. What are you talking about?
What are they eating with a fork and a knife? Who are you hanging out with? What happened to you? You get that damn pizza and you fold it.
No, they take it and of course, living in Florida all those years, I mean, of course they don't make
pizza. The pizza was horrible.
It was absolutely horrible.
There's nothing like a New York
It's like
slice.
eating a piece of cardboard. And that's why, because you could hold the slice, so flat. Stiffly, and you could hold it flat, and you could eat it like that. It's like Little Caesars, like it's so hard like that. But no, but real New York pizza, you gotta.
Yes.
The cheese is falling out. You got to really hold it with both hands.
Is dripping out the back. You have to fold it. You got to fold that. You got to fold that slice. Right. If you've never been to New York, you may or may not know what we're talking about. But a New York slice of pizza.
Oh yeah.
You pull out a fork and a knife, and if I see that, I'm going to slap that fork and knife out of your hand. Unless you're eating Chicago deep dish, like Chicago deep dish, you got to eat that with a fork and a knife. You can't manhandle that.
Right.
But regular New York pizza, you should be grabbing that with your hand, folding it, and digging in, and just going for it.
And the bell bottom pants, the shoes, the
iconic white suit, which
of course the hair, right? Don't touch the hair. Don't touch.
Spend a lot of time on my hair, and you hit it.
I used to get ribbed all the time because I used to have a comb in my back pocket. Yeah. Remember?
Absolutely.
It was the big purple comb, like pulling it out.
It inspired a lot of things, and that white suit became so iconic. Movie critic Gene Siskel actually purchased it. He bought the suit. I don't think he said if he ever tried it on or fit into it. But this was many years later.
Can you imagine?
But he bought it at an auction. I mean, it was one of those. It became such an iconic thing. It was parodied in the movie Airplane, right? They kind of ribbed on it then, so it got into pop culture. The Bee Gees would also soak into pop culture. Actually, more recently on SNL with the Barry Gibb show, where Jimmy Fallon and Justin Timberlake would do a Barry Gibb impression, and that was from that prime Bee Gees era. Right. Yeah, so what goes around comes around.
Right. The joke was Barry Gibb was so big at the time. Like, you don't mess with Barry. I'm Barry effing Gibb. You don't mess with.
Yeah. And that kind of like that reverence and respect came back around. They got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I was very when that happened, I was like, it's deserved. Was the vindication.
Yeah.
That was the respect kind of laid at their feet that they deserved.
Mm-hmm.
Because, call it what you want, call it disco, whatever. You can't dismiss what they did, though. Whether or not it's dated, whether or not it was, passé, what they did in that 3 or 4 year span of time, just even with their work outside of Saturday Night Fever, their work and then what they did afterwards. They did that song Tragedy, which, oh my God, you want to talk about him making your ears bleed. I mean, Barry Gibb absolutely terrorizes your eardrums on that song, but I love it because it's like he really went for it. And it's just great music. I'm a sucker for pop music, so I'm gonna like it no matter what.
Sure, yeah.
Call it disco, call it country, call it whatever you want. But during that era, all that stuff would be on the radio, so you would just be exposed to everything. So for me, it wasn't like, oh, I'm listening to disco or I'm listening to a country song. It was just the stuff that was on the radio, no matter what.
Yeah.
So this was just part of the patchwork and the quilt.
Yeah, much like the disco floor, right? That that patchy floor, that lights up.
All the different lights.
Yeah, each light representing a hit song from the period, you know.
And then they had that show Dance Fever, because Denny Terrio, who did the choreography for John Travolta, so he cashed in, and then it was just a show with them disco dancing, right? Yeah. Each week there'd be like different couples or whatever, and they'd be just dancing. So this became like a whole cottage industry. It really, like I said earlier, if disco, if they were saying that disco was limping along, this certainly did give it, the paddles and give it an electric shock to kind of reinvigorate it for at least a little bit longer, until we got to the 80s, because then by then it was done.
And what's wrong with that too? Like you think about it, it's like, what is so wrong about people wanting to go to a place to dance, right? I mean, people are having fun. They're, of course, there's a lot more, to it, but whatever. But the whole point is, like, that became a fad. Dancing became a fad, like much like the way it was in the 50s. You go to the juke joints and that kind of thing. And here it's like, it was really great to see, in a social setting, that people are actually exercising. What's so wrong about that? Like, then of course that turned into like roller skating. That became a thing in the 80s, like the late 70s, early 80s. That so what is so bad about, why is there such a stigma to that? I wonder that this, it's frowned upon, like disco is like, that kind of thing.
Well, I think it was. I think it was looked on as very kitschy also, and not quote unquote serious music, right? It was like not serious music where they're not saying anything like Bob Dylan was making a statement, or Crosby, Stills and Nash.
No, it's not political.
They're not saying anything. This was just music that and there's a place for that. Good. Yeah, there's a place for it to just go and not be preached to, or not have to hear a message.
People
you're going to enjoy.
And they let off the work, the work week. They let off steam. There's a lot of. I'm sure there was a ton of reputable type clubs like that where they would play disco music, and you just went to have fun. You weren't there to like, it wasn't like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, that's what Studio 54 got. Yeah, I mean,
reached that level, but you went to have fun.
Anything, anytime, anywhere.
Yeah. Right. And it was nice that, like I mentioned in Florida, like there were clubs down in a place called Ybor City, and you go to these clubs and they would go back and play this music, which was great. They weren't just playing like, the music of the day. They were playing, they're going back and playing the old stuff, and not necessarily the long extended versions. You would hear the song as it appears on the record, and that's just.
And then have some shitty pizza. And try and complete the whole
time
thing.
Is the ultimate judge. I mean, it's it transcends the generations, and it keeps coming back. So of course,
but do you think this has? Because I'll be honest, I don't really hear people talking about Saturday Night Fever when we talk about music. Has it kind of been lost in the shuffle? Is this something that people should kind of?
Well, no, I don't
revisit.
I don't think. I mean, you can't help but slip it in there. I don't think people are specifically talking about Saturday Night Fever, but it's the whole come around of disco and combining it with something new. Of course, there's the mashup. You can't go to these places without hearing at least one Bee Gees song in the mix somewhere,
which is going to be Stayin' Alive,
right?
Pretty much,
pretty much. But it does. It lives on. I think it holds up extremely well, but in a good way, in a very cultural way, in a very, like I said, I love that anyway. Anything old, I like going back and looking at it from that point of view, from a historical point of view. Yeah. It's like literally going to a museum without having to go to a museum. You watch this stuff, you listen to this stuff, because you might not have been a part of it physically, or perhaps you were too young, maybe a little too old, whatever. I mean, but it still existed, and it was still very much part of the culture of the time. And those are it creates memories, and one thing leads to another, and you're probably sitting there weeping in the dark.
That must be you again.
Some nights, just sitting there like,
he tears up when he puts on Saturday Night Fever.
No, I'm joking, but
no, I think that as well. And this could be a tough nut for some people to crack, right? Yeah. It's easy to talk about a lot of classic rock because you hear, you kind of still are exposed to it. You hear it here and there. This is a very specific type of music and a very specific album. And yeah, there's a lot of hits on it, but there's also this other music. And I think that's the important thing, is to get past the popular stuff that you know. And that was, for me, that was really the special part was, I knew, all the hits, but to kind of revisit some of the stuff, I knew the melodies because I remember those instrumentals, but to sit and listen to them now as produced pieces of music and hear all the different layers and just the different instruments and the arrangement that went into it. And now I can appreciate that, as opposed to, this is disco and it's really popular and everyone's listening to it. I'm going to listen to it too. That's great when you're young. Now looking back on it, I'm sitting here listening to them like, this is just really well put together music, like the incidental stuff. And I'm, not talking about the stuff that was either culled from previous albums or the Bee Gees, but Manhattan Skyline and those other songs are just they kind of fill in the gaps where the Bee Gees kind of are, can't go where some of the instrumental stuff went. Their bread and butter, their stock and trade is the vocals, the harmonies, and the great sounds. And they kind of meld. They're closer to melding it to rock. I never really, even at their danciest, I never really, thought that, like, if you listen to You Should Be Dancing, there's a scorching guitar solo in that song. So it's not like, this is a straight up disco song. They still had those other elements that they were putting into their music.
Yeah.
So I never bought in that they were like the kings or the standard bearers of disco. Yeah. If you say disco to me, I'd say I Will Survive or Donna Summer or any of those things, even Chic, right? Good Times and some of those songs. I would put that closer to there. Yep. The Bee Gees are kind of almost guilty by association because they were asked to do this after the fact, right? So they didn't know what it's kind of like, okay. And then when they started producing stuff, that I think Robert Stigwood or whoever was involved with the film, like, oh my God, we love this. It's great. So they kept on.
Disco became disco. So people were writing songs that were specifically disco, but when you consider, and they kind of, it almost became a musical caricature. In itself, like that's, but when you consider the music that already existed, that kind of lended itself to that sound, soul, funk, Earth, Wind and Fire, those groups, the Spinners, the Philadelphia soul sound, all of this stuff that, which again has that very lush, rich production sense. And then all of a sudden it became a danceable thing. And then people were actually writing songs to accommodate that more. So like you mentioned before, things became much more instrumental. They stretched out to 10 minutes, 15 minutes long. But the whole point is it almost felt like it was already there to begin with. And things just change. And then, that becomes part of it for a while. You start to take that for granted.
Yeah.
So like you say, when you listen to it now you really start to appreciate what it was and what it,
absolutely
should have done at the time, but we just
you're young, so it's different. You're in a different headspace. You're in a different headspace. But when you revisit it now, knowing what or understanding it and not just being like when you're young listening to pop music, you're listening to it just because it sounds nice and it sounds.
So I have two questions for you.
All right, question number one:
what is your favorite Bee Gees track?
My favorite Bee Gees track. It's going to be a toss up. If we're talking about stuff that was written for, if you're talking about stuff that was written for the soundtrack, I'm going to go with Night Fever. Love that song. But You Should Be Dancing.
Oh goodness. Yeah.
is like, wow, so it would be a toss up between those two.
Yeah. I agree with that. And I'm probably More Than a Woman is my favorite. Their version of it. Their version? Yeah, I love their version as well because I love the moment in the film. When I think of that, when I hear that song, I think of that scene in the film, which is a pivotal moment in the movie. But so my second question is this the definitive soundtrack of all time? I mean, that's a loaded.
Yeah. I mean, if if I say yes, that means we're never going to talk about another soundtrack because it would pale in comparison. I'm going to say, is it the ultimate soundtrack?
Is it the best sound? Or is it, you think it is the, we're not talking about record sales. We're talking about what you think is
about listening.
Yeah.
I'm going to say no.
Okay.
The reason why is because this is very, if you're talking about if you're talking about soundtracks, it's very easy to say this because it's so accessible, right? All this music is so great, but I think what I would probably say that the soundtrack to Star Wars, honestly.
Oh, okay.
Because that made scores something that people started to listen to.
Well, I was referring to needle drop.
Got it.
Score, like songs, as soundtracks made up of songs rather than score music. That's a whole. Got it.
Okay. Well, then see, I now I can walk that back, and I just tipped my hand for another episode if we ever do Star Wars soundtrack. I would put it up there. I can't think of Pulp Fiction might be up there as well as far as like this type of a soundtrack, but I think this is so of its time and so evocative that it's got to be up there. Because of just the impact. You can't discount the impact that it had as well.
I agree. I totally agree. It was definitely of its time. When you think of Pulp Fiction, these were songs that are cobbled together
from different eras,
from different
genres.
Eras. Exactly. It's sort of a melting pot, if you will, and that's Tarantino anyway. All his films are, an homage to something. So,
you're right.
When I think about that in that way, and the only other soundtrack I could probably think of, it's a period film, but something like Oh Brother,
or American Graffiti,
where all those songs are of a specific era or a specific time frame. I get
what you're saying. When you put it like that, I mean, this is about a specific thing, and the music evokes a specific thing. And when I listen to it without thinking about the movie, it evokes a certain thing as well too. So you're right about that. Meaning, does this get the job done for a soundtrack to be a good companion with the movie, where I can listen to this and kind of get the same kind of feeling from it? Then you're right. Yes.
Yeah.
I'll go with it.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that as well. I mean, the film is a whole separate entity in itself. You get to hear all this great music in the film, but the film itself is good enough. It didn't rely, to me, on the soundtrack, where I could separate the two and just visit the soundtrack and really enjoy it and have the same effect of something, a cultural thing of its time, and I can get something from both.
Do you concur?
So, yeah, I do concur.
I concur.
I should have just led with that, right? I should have just.
That's from Catch Me If You Can.
On and on and on.
Do you concur, Doctor? Yeah, I concur. We'll get to Catch Me If You Can one day. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. This is. I think that's going to do it for this episode. I think we've advocated for
Saturday
Night Fever, and absolutely. Even if you weren't around at the time, weren't born at the time, I think it's something you can listen to. There's going to be that familiarity with the Bee Gees because you can't get away from them. So they are ingrained in our musical consciousness. They're ingrained in pop culture. So you've got the in there, but then listen to the rest of the album. It's got just great music. It's very listenable. If you put it this way, if you're in a really good mood, put this album on because I think you'll kind of be more open to it.
Sure.
Just because it's so upbeat and there's no ballads on this thing. So it's not like it's going to drag you down. It's just kind of really just up tempo, great stuff. If you're on a drive too, this is another good one that you could put on and just kind of have that music on that you can just kind of, you don't have to think about and just kind of listen to it while you're driving. I think this is a great one for kind of just having on in the car.
Yeah,
as well.
I agree.
Because I listen to it. Basically, I listen to this pretty much every time. I listen to it in the car when we were doing in the run up, because it was just one of those ones I could put on and just kind of be driving and listening and enjoying it and kind of taking it in and having the whole experience. So that's going to do it for this episode of the 3324 podcast. Join us every week as we talk about the best in music and movies. And then we go off and talk about pizza and, you know, how crappy it is in Florida and how great it is in New York.
Pizza. Yeah.
We're going to get into bagels next.
Can and walk down the street with a paint can in your hand. There you go.
And then we will talk about how great New York bagels are versus the rest of the country as well. So we will find a movie that will we can kind of go off on that tangent as well. So the only way you're going to find out which episode we do talk about how great New York bagels are is to listen to us each week. Mm-hmm. So why don't you do that? Join us on social media, won't you? We would love to see you there as well. We have a lot of great people that interact there, and it's your chance to show your love for music and movies. And we would love to hear what you have to say. So definitely join us online. Check us out. Join the conversation at 3324 Podcast on Instagram and Facebook. And for Eric, this has been Dean. And since this is a double album, we'll see you on both flip sides.
You've been listening to the 3324 Podcast with Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber. You can find us on your favorite podcast provider, so please like, subscribe, and rate to become a part of the 3324 family. Your feedback is important, so make sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at 3324 Podcast and on Twitter at 3324P to join the conversation.